So, I've been seeing, um, a lot of people recently using Mel Brooks as a sort of blanket defense of any kind of, satire that transgresses societal taboos. Um, and this is nothing new. I've been seeing, oh, Mel Brooks used in this way for decades. You couldn't make a Mel Brooks movie today cause I saw blazing saddles yesterday, but the problem with that line of thinking is, it misunderstands what made Mel Brooks great, what makes him resonate. So today, we gonna talk about Mel Brooks. The year was 2004. Are you gonna eat your tots? The United States had just invaded Iraq. The Black Eyed Peas were getting retarded in here. Let's get retarded. Let's get retarded in here. Zach Braff was at his artistic peak. Blah, 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 blah. And the producers was still one of the hottest tickets on Broadway. Stand alone. Stand behind me. Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick had returned to the roles which they had originated, which had netted a then record-breaking 12 Tonys. Student rush tickets were really cheap back then, so I was seeing every musical that I could on Broadway. But to this day, I have never laughed harder at any stage production than at that original cast of Mel Brooks, the producers in 2004. Come on, Germans, go into your dance. And if you've only seen the movie adaptation of the stage musical, you might be wondering, really, work, 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 work. And yes, I can't even really explain what was lost in translation in the movie adaptation of the musical. It's functionally identical. Perhaps too identical, because everything that made it work on stage, it just doesn't work on film. They come here, they all come here. How do they find 'em? That the aesthetics of breaking the fourth wall on film are just different than on stage. Why Bloom goes so far? Camera right. The stage musical is also a big love letter to the heydays of the 40s and 50s musical pageantry, and the world of the stage in general. We all love this thing called the theater. The movie version either did not know how to capture this, or did not care to capture this on film. But maybe just being in the same room with these world-class trained showgirls tap dancing in stormtrooper outfits is just hilarious. We on screen, it's like, it just feels tired. It feels like we've been here before. That is why they call me Rolf. Don't be stupid, be a smarty. Come and join the Nazi party. So if you guys want to talk about Mel Brooks and where, when, and how he was a comedy innovator, then let's talk about Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks was born Melvin Kaminsky in Brooklyn, New York in 1926. His father died when he was 2, and the youngest of 4 boys. He was a small sickly kid who got picked on a lot. Brooks would later go on to say that this was where he learned to use comedy as a defense mechanism to cloak his pain in humor. I want to thank Hitler for being such a funny guy on stage. Mel Brooks would also like you to know that he is a Jew. Jews in space. Behind me you see a phalanx, an avalanche of Jews who have come with their the they we I of vow meal you with We re-Jews out in space. We re-zooming along protecting the Hebrew race. I don't like the way you re-walking. You've been into the sacramental wine again. Then go and attack us. We'll give them a smack. We'll slap them right back in the face. After serving as a corporal in World War I in Germany, engaging in such operations as defusing landmines, Brooks was hired by Sid Caesar to be a television comedy writer. It was during this period as a television writer that Brooks developed his comedy ethos, which is basically throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Halt. Du hast gespritzt in general. You see this in his most popular movies. It's just joke after joke after joke. If there is a dud, there is hardly time for it to land before the next joke starts. Well, that's the end of this suit. The end of this suit. So while Brooks definitely had an ethos, biases, and a point of view in his comedy, the rapid-fire nature of it kind of make it clear that he didn't think through the implications of a lot of it. You've just entered the territory of Robin Hood and his merry men. Fagoleth. No, no, no. We re-straight. Just merry. Some of Brooks' comedy, with gay characters in particular, has aged poorly. While Brooks was certainly not averse to physical comedy and slapstick. Fag, fag, faggle, faggle, his bread and butter tended to rest more on transgression of societal taboos. Some of it has aged well. Come on. How about a good old motherfucker works song? I get no kick from champagne. Some of it has not. Watch me, faggot. And here's why that doesn't bother me personally as a viewer. Comedy is the quickest to age and the most likely to age poorly. Yes, some of it, even a lot of it, is problematic. Yes, You can still enjoy it. I do. His 1974 film Blazing Saddles is one of the great transgressive comedies of all time. Here we take the good time and trouble to slaughter every last Indian in the West. And for what? So they can appoint a sheriff that's blacker than any Indian. From top to bottom, Blazing Saddles is a razor-sharp skewering of the absurdity of racism. These are people of the land, the common clay of the New West. You know, Morons. And this is part of what makes Brooks so fondly remembered today, where the likes of, say, David Zucker are kind of said, well, people still think airplane is funny, so there's that. I picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue. As an outgrowth from his difficult childhood, Brooks was just about comedy for comedy's sake. Comedy could be a weapon. And one of Brooks' favorite targets happened to be history's greatest monster, Hitler on ice. Brooks saw comedy not just as a weapon of ridicule, but as a way of robbing Hitler of his posthumous power. Brooks' approach of reductio ad absurdum to nazis was a catharsis for Jewish identity. And this hardly started with Brooks. Yiddish folklore is full of these trickster, Bugs Bunny-style characters who confront corrupt and unjust power structures using nothing but their wits, Herschel Vostropol being one of the most well-known. The Inquisition. Look out, Sam. We have a mission to convert the Jews. Brooks' subjects also weren't limited to Nazi violence against the Jews. Take one of the more famous scenes from History of the World, Part 1. It's better to lose your skullcap than your skull, or your guvalt. There you have Brooks' own filmmaking light of a period of history that, while nowhere near the Holocaust in terms of scale, still openly targeted Jewish citizens. And it's debatable how mining Jewish suffering, even if you are Jewish, for comedy in the Spanish Inquisition differs from the Holocaust, which Brooks has always avoided depicting directly. But he has also gone on record as saying that the root of a lot of his humor is anger, specifically anger at anti-Semitism. The problem with this kind of media, created by a Jew as an expression of Jewish identity, to be consumed largely, however, by a Gentile audience, is that the Goliath will always watch you, watch you, watch you, watch you, watch you, watch you. And there's a little bit of troubling history of things that Jews say and do being misrepresented and used against them. Let's go back now, way back before Brooks, to what laid the groundwork for springtime for Hitler to even survive and thrive in the first place. Yes, let's go back to the big inquest. Go back to the history. Film about World War I was box office gold before the United States even entered the war, and most everything that came out during that time glorified the war machine just as much as anything Germany was charting out. Film and literature about the war were used to boost a narrative of American exceptionalism and greatness, according to Thomas Doherty. But while this American ascendancy was fueled by images of the machine of war, little confronted the actual ideology of fascism or the true horrors perpetrated in the name of Hitler's Reich. One of the earliest and most well-known examples of satirizing Hitler's brand of fascism came in the form of Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. A huge chunk of The Great Dictator is a very surreal watch today. It consists of cute, wacky hijinks in the Jewish ghetto in the fictional country of Tamania. See, concentration camps were certainly a thing in 1940, and it was a thing Americans knew about. But the scope of it was not the scope we know today. The Great Dictator was made in a time when Hitler's death machine was only a possibility and not a historical reality. The Great Dictator is unique not only in that it confronts Hitler's ideology, but that it also puts Hitler's biggest targets, the Jews, at the forefront. But Chaplin gives neither Hitler nor the Nazis even the dignity of being named. The German analog Adnoid Hinkel is not even given a language. The great dictator dictates in gibberish. But the Jews are given a name. The great dictator does not pussyfoot around about who exactly Adnoid Hinkel intends to exterminate. The Jews are given a name and an identity, where Hitler is only alluded to. A less well-known YIRA comedy following in Chaplin's footsteps was Ernst Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be, which follows the exploits of Jews in occupied Warsaw. Mel Brooks loved this movie so much that he remade it in the 80s, and that did not go over as well as The Producers or Blazing Saddles. While The Great Dictator was a success, it was not without controversy, with resistance against the film coming from isolationist Americans and fascist sympathizers. Despite the success of The Great Dictator, few in Hollywood dared follow in Chaplin's footsteps by openly addressing Hitler's ideology. But this did not go on to start a trend of films that were terribly concerned with the plight of the Jews in Germany and the rest of Europe because, believe it or not, Americans weren't terribly sympathetic to the plight of the Jews in 1940. To put it in perspective, Americans are more receptive to the idea of welcoming Syrian refugees into America today than they were Jewish refugees in 1939. There was a lot of withined media during and after the war, but not a whole lot followed in Chaplin's footsteps. In 1963, political theorist Hannah Arendt, herself a German Jew who fled the Reich during Hitler's rise to power, reported on Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in a series of essays for The New Yorker called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Eichmann, who was on trial for Nazi war crimes, showed no remorse and claimed no responsibility for what he had taken part in. He was remarkable for his unremarkability. The Israeli government sent no fewer than 6 psychologists to examine Eichmann, none of whom found any trace of mental illness. Arendt's essays discredited the idea that Nazi criminals were psychopathic or different from normal people. As Eichmann saw it, he was just doing his job. He not only obeyed orders, he also obeyed the law. And then I maintain, in regard to the words discussed verbally, there was no place for discussions. These were orders. Eichmann proved that you do not have to be a born and bred monster to do monstrous things, that anyone was capable of this. Arendt's report, in addition to a wider cultural understanding in America of the breadth and scope of Hitler's atrocities, began to cause a shift in the American relationship with the mere idea of war, especially with the looming threat in Vietnam. Where earlier films about World War I seemed heroic and necessary, this shift began to see such films, omissions of Hitler's atrocities, as unpalatable. There was a need to reconcile the humanity of the Nazis with their actions in order to continue making media about them. But the reality that evil is really quite banal did not make for compelling Hollywood cinema. According to Barlow, the nature of evil itself, argues Hannah Arendt, is thought-defying, because thought trees to reach some depth, to go to the roots, and the moment it concerns itself with evil, it is frustrated because there is nothing. That is its banality. In the 2 decades following the end of the war, a changing understanding of Hitler's atrocities and their relationship to the American identity would shape the way that Nazis were portrayed in film. With regard to depicting the German Nazis seen by American film and culture, Aaron Barlow outlines 2 phases: an initial one generated by the needs of war, and a later one reacting to that earlier version. A major characteristic of that later phase reacting to that earlier phase was the attempt to grapple with the unthinkable evil encompassed by the Holocaust. What about the rest of the world? Did you not know the intentions of the Third Reich? Did you not hear the words of Hitler broadcast all over the world? But an increasingly complex understanding of World War I moving away from the machine of war and moving towards the tragedy of the Holocaust, begin to dampen American desires to see world war portrayed on screen. There's just no real glory in conquest when you know what those soldiers are going to discover on the other side of those woods. So exit best years of our lives, and sands of Iwo Jima enter the diary of Anne Frank, the pawnbroker, and judgment at Nuremberg. Where's the responsibility of the world leader Winston Churchill, who said in an open letter to the London Times in 1938, "Your Honour, were England to suffer a national disaster, I should pray to God to send a man of the strength of mind and will of an Adolf Hitler." Are we now to find Winston Churchill guilty? Part of the problem with attempts to come to terms with the unbelievable horrors of the Holocaust also came to be an unwillingness to delve too deeply into the commonality of evil that shows real negotiation with the American people's own culpability. Where's the responsibility of those American industrialists who helped Hitler to rebuild his armaments and profited by that rebuilding? Aaron Barlow contends that Americans began to push away the questions raised, turning the perpetrators into unhuman villains, into parodies of villainy, into something that we can live with, for it becomes absolutely removed from us. Hollywood's later approach would escalate to the likes of Steven Spielberg adding literal supernatural element to a seemingly supernatural evil in films like Raiders of the Lost Ark. We see this perhaps most explicitly with Captain America and Hydra, where the Red Skull is posed as making the Nazis look like the lesser evil compared to Hydra, even though from their look to their occult inspiration, to their goals, to their goofy salute, they are functionally identical to the Nazis. Hang. Glider. Also, Holocaust want Holocaust. But in the 1960s, at this still early stage in American identity reconciling its relationship to the Holocaust, the horrors were still too fresh for the kind of direct representation we would see in the 90s and 2000s with the likes of Schindler's List, The Pianist, and Life is Beautiful. Buongiorno, Principessa. Last night I dreamt about you all night. Oh. Finding a way to keep World War I narratives relevant and sympathetic was proving increasingly difficult in light of the new cultural concerns, and as the war receded even further and further into the past, and possibilities for spectacle reached their limit. Which is to say nothing about that other cloud hanging over the world at the time. That mushroom cloud. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, according to Pauline Kael, opened a new movie era. Indeed, Strangelove seems to be where the switch flipped, both in the wider culture's relationship to its past and to its doomed present, in the film's own subtitle, How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And boy, you had to stop worrying and love the bomb in the 1960s just to live. Like today, we do not appreciate just how close we came several times to total nuclear war. It's kind of a miracle we still exist. The Nazi presence in Strangelove is more subtext than text, with the titular Strangelove an implied former Nazi war criminal who now works for the global nuclear war machine. Strangelove can store all the information about the war. The evil of the Nazi is almost trivial when pitted against Cold War-era global nuclear annihilation. The effect of this was not to trivialize Nazism, but to give filmmakers new tools with which to explore the horrors both of their past, their present, and an increasingly unlikely future. And if dark comedy and satire were used as a tool, it would be a tool to make the world a better place. It would be a tool to make the world a better place. It would be a tool to make the world a better place. And if dark comedy and satire were used to come to terms with the sort of Damocles hanging over the head of every American and Russian and, well, everyone during the Cold War, then so too could dark comedy be used to come to terms with and explore the horrors of Hitler's reach. If he opens his big mouth again, it's lampshade time. Shut up. What? You written a book. Yeah, it's like all my thoughts and stuff. It's called I'm Can. Andrew Gross and Susan Aroer describe the problem of comedy tackling heavy subject matters as a perception of comedy being generally considered less sophisticated, raid, incapable, than the more so-called novel genres such as tragedy or conventional historical drama. Part of what makes a societal taboo a taboo is the presumption that it should not be touched or discussed, even by higher arts, much less lower arts like comedy. All right, Jay, it's time to show these people what Black Power is all about. You better put your hood on. This, of course, does not give comedy, particularly black comedy, its due credit. Black comedy is sometimes the best means for challenging harmful societal constructs and mores. According to Warren Barlow, comedy is most persuasive, which is perhaps to say instructive, when put in the morally realistic context of tragic potential. Thus, much of what is called black humor and its attendant obscenity derives from the recognition that the truest fiction requires fusion of the tragic and the comic. What do you think of Mr. Hilton's policies? Well, I don't like the sound of these here concentration bamps. Well, I gave him a baby toe kiss and he bit it. Farce allows obscenity to succeed or at least be dealt with. In situations where otherwise, audiences would be offended and even non-existent. Life's a piece of shit when you look at it. It could be argued that farce was not only inevitable, but necessary in order to prime audiences for dealing with more realistic, somber portrayals in Holocaust fiction. When used smartly, comedy puts the unspeakable into understandable symbols through absurdism, without dragging marginalized groups through the mud. Through farce, the problems that were arising within filmic presentations of the Nazi, problems arising from new recognition that the simplistic diversions into good and bad that had been useful for the war effort, but that were of little real validity, could be sidestepped. Prima facie evil, the Nazi could always be insulted and abused. Or, turned around, the Nazi can lose without sympathy. This turn to farce allowed World War I film to survive, even as aspects of it that now seemed troubling began to fade from the genre. The late 1960s also saw a rise in films that took a more farcical bent to approaching Hitler's regime, including The Dirty Dozen, Hogan's Heroes, Catchminus 22, and, of course, The Producers. And now it's a springtime for Hitler and Germany. The Producers tells the story of Max Bialystock, played by Zero Mostel, a washed-up hack Broadway producer who talks Leopold Blum, played by Gene Wilder, a mousy, emasculated accountant who seeks comfort, and his blanket huey making me extremely nervous, into creating an intentional Broadway flop in order to ride off the business losses and steal the money from the financiers. But when the worst show they can find, Springtime for Hitler, a gay romp with Adolf and Eva through Burt Scott, becomes an unexpected success, the two end up in prison. One of the studios Brooks initially approached said that they would make The Producers if and only if Brooks changed it to Springtime for Mussolini. Why was it Universal? Because they said Hitler is too strong, too menacing. How about Springtime for Mussolini? Given that Mussolini's depiction in American media, in comparison to Hitler, seemed mostly to be about making fun of fascism and being peace with Hitler, while not having to get our hands dirty with that whole Holocaust thing. And when we talk about The Producers now, especially as a defense of a joke about whatever one facet of the gestation of The Producers is that it was actually pretty controversial upon initial release. Time has been kinder to The Producers than critics were in 1968. The Busby Berkeley musical centerpiece Springtime for Hitler caused considerable offense, prompting numerous, mostly Jewish, walkouts during the film's initial release. In Brooks' own words, the Jews were horrified. I received resentful letters of protest saying things like, "How can you make jokes about Hitler? The man murdered 6 million Jews." It was only after Peter Sellers gave the film a glowing public endorsement in Variety that the film gradually built up a cult audience, and Brooks eventually won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for the producers. But while the joke in the film is that Bialystok had found the most offensive musical possible, guaranteeing a flop in his mind, I am the sound the zal wild the souls I'll so cold I'll sell thels I'll the I will It's practically a love letter to Hitler. This won't run a week. A week? Are you kidding? This play has got to close on page 4. Brooks' use of Hitler as its subject was not arbitrary. In Brooks' own words, "Of course it is impossible to take revenge for 6 million murdered Jews, but by using the medium of comedy we can try to rob Hitler of his posthumous power and might." Hitler must have had a magnetic, attractive force. Like a rock star, he used his voice to spellbind umpteen thousands of listeners, so it's only fitting when comic actors make him the limelight hog of world history. We take away from him the holy seriousness that always surrounded him and protected him like a cordon. Tea, sura, tea, lyco, surco, oeo, the thou helpest. Brooks later stated in an interview at 60 Minutes, "There is only one way to get even with Hitler. You have to bring him down with ridicule." Though The Producers was initially met with mixed reviews, the film has since become celebrated for the way it ridicules fascism in the same vein as Chaplin's The Great Dictator, particularly Springtime for Hitler. Film historian Robert Reamer celebrates Springtime as a triumph of anti-fascist satire. Susan Guber interprets this parody of fascism as racial camp mocking the shoddy theatricality of fascism. Both Guber and Reamer side with Brooks in their interpretation of the Springtime number. That ridicule of Nazi propaganda methods does rob Hitler of some of his posthumous power. But again, This praise of the producers is not universal. Film historian Petro Raw takes a much colder view on the producers. In addition to finding many of the comedic elements thoughtless and hypocritical, talk about bad taste, like what did these people expect in a musical called Springtime for Hitler? She particularly takes issue with Brooks' appropriation of fascist imagery. There is one frame during the Springtime for Hitler number wherein the dancers move to form a swastika on the stage, a direct reference to Leni Riefenstahl doing the same in Nazi propaganda. Raw argues that the tools of fascist theatricality are not shoddy, as Brooks describes, and are rather highly effective propaganda tools. That's why they worked. Merely recreating the tools of fascism in a heightened, cartoonish state is not enough to create satisfying satire. And in that way, Brooks' use of Hitler can feel almost incidental. Really, making a play about the most offensive thing imaginable could have been about anything, since the butt of the joke is really Bialystok and Bloom underestimating the audience, not Hitler himself. So the question then becomes, where does satire cross the line from being a valid, transgressive art that challenges harmful societal constructs to too subtle and perhaps in danger of people missing the point entirely? And that's the problem. There isn't a line. This is a journey into money. Loads of money. There is an episode of Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, which is called the Satire Paradox, which, with apologies, I will borrow from a great deal here. Oi, you! Shut your mouth and look at me wad. The episode begins with a discussion on Harry Enfield, a well-known comedian in Britain and also an avowed leftist who hated Margaret Thatcher. No, Nigel. No. Bad dog. Nigel. Enfield and his partner Paul Whitehouse dreamed up a character to embody Thatcher's England. And it sort of just became this sort of thing, really, where we did just go loads of money about everything, you know. His name was Loads of Money. He was a construction worker who was subjected to sudden delirious wealth by the 80s building boom. So we sort of did it the other way, which is just to go, look at aren't I great? Isn't money great? Everything else is rubbish. Only money is good. But the lesson Enfield took from the whole thing was, despite the clear derision with which Loads of Money was framed, people only took it as it was intended if they already were aligned with Enfield politically. You know, I mean, it's great fun to do, but generally, you know, it's just about questioning what's there because we allowed to question what's there, so we do. But it doesn't ever change anyone's mind. Same with Stephen Colbert. The real Colbert has never made a secret of the fact that he holds liberal political views in real life. Never will the Everybody's been saying, has America lost its mind? And the answer is evidently, back off, buddy. We got 300 million guns and we kind of stressed right now. But conservative viewers of the Colbert Report don't see his character the same way liberal viewers do. Yes, obviously, the Colbert of the Colbert Report was a character, but where the left-leaning viewer sees a character to be mocked, where the Colbert, the Colberting viewer, was character to be I feel well, where view, where do you, or the car, I the car, berry car, I am sorry, I've never been a fan of books. I don't trust them. The conservative-leaning viewer sees a funny man speaking truth to power. I think I would have made a fabulous press secretary. I have nothing but contempt for these people. So essentially, they saw what they wanted to see. So the big takeaway here of this study was that this is what we would call motivated cognition or biased perception. See also Tenafis Sarah Palin. I can see Russia from my house. Lawford's character might have been made by and for liberals, but Palin was just so darn likable that conservatives who supported Palin were endeared to it too. Tina Fey even went on to make an episode of 30 Rock about this very paradox. I'm gonna have to take a moment here. I sat on me testicles earlier, and the heft of my body smashed them to smithereens. Hulk, start working on the wig. The In-Universe show's parody of a dangerously inept political candidate ends up making him more endearing. Because it's making him likable. He's actually very mean. But with Trissy Jordan playing him. Well, playing he's a lovable buffoon. They read just talking about how funny Trissy is. And Fee's character, Liz Lemon, is faced with the dilemma of what to do with this. But these are all examples of deliberate satire. The issue gets even more thorny when you look at representation that is not satire. The white man marches on. American History X is a great example of the satire paradox for something that is not satire. The text of the film is explicitly anti-fascist, a cautionary tale that unmistakably condemns white supremacy. But you know what group loves the imagery in American History X? Neo-Nazis. Neo-Nazis love the imagery in this movie. The text shows neo-Nazism and white supremacy is bad. Isn't it also kind of badass? Isn't it kind of cool the way he's framed? Isn't Edward Norton a badass when he's an uncut neo-Nazi alpha? And then there, Hans Landa from Inglourious Bastards, who has become more of a symbol for fun and charm and charisma than of evil. Oh, that's a bingo. And you might argue that that's the point. But what is the point if what people remember most about the movie is how fun the evil Nazi was? Audiences might have lost the thread of the intended point. And then there's Tomorrow Belongs to Me, a chilling moment from the film version of Cabaret, which has recently been adopted by some white nationalists as an anthem. But do you know what has? So we have explicitly anti-fascist dramas where the text has been appropriated by white supremacists, but in this case the comedy, which satirically praises Hitler, has not. Which lends credence to Brooks' notion that highlighting the absurdism of fascist theatricality actually does rob Hitler of his posthumous power. But just because you can't help what the world will do with your representation, be it satirical or non-satirical, it doesn't mean that satire is free from criticism. Satire needs intent, it needs logic, it needs to be making a statement about the thing it is satirizing, or else it's bad satire. Brooks describes this as satire of the shoddy theatrics of fascism. To Rough's credit, the theatrical techniques of fascism were highly effective, but they were also extremely fragile, which is why the police state maintained such a stranglehold on the press. You weren't allowed to ridicule fascism in Nazi Germany because its theatricality, at its core, could not survive ridicule. This is what hyper-nationalism looks like. Women dressed as pretzels and beer. This is what Nazi theatricality looks like. Tap-dancing stormtroopers and marching in swastika formation. That image is lifted directly from Nazi propaganda, and it does take a lot of modification to make it look ridiculous. See, this particular scene is all about lens. The Nazi vision in the producers is a text written by a literal Nazi, produced through a Jewish lens for a Gentile audience. The story, the framing, and who is telling the story is all relevant. So this isn't just Hitler for Hitler's sake. It's a theatricality that unmistakably showcases the absurdity of ethno-nationalism, which is why white nationalists tend not to like it in the way that they like American history acts. You can't make it not absurd. So the idea that Brooks wanted to make a musical out of the most offensive thing and just kind of picked Nazis at random is false. Brooks had something to say about the Nazis, about the way they viewed themselves and the way they presented themselves to the world. But this also rubs up against that satire paradox. Perhaps the intended target of the satire goes missed by a large portion of the audience. Man, you know, I kind of miss the days when it was, like, taken as a given by most people that a joke at the expense of Hitler isn't the same as a joke at the expense of millions of murdered Jews. But, you know, the times they are a-changin', and that's a discussion that needs to be had. Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory! Given the rise of far-right movements, fascism, and neo-Nazism in the last 2 years all over the Western world, much debate has arisen as to the ethical concerns of laughing at the devil, as Brooks has done. Do films like the producers rob Nazis of their power, or do they create an atmosphere that encourages audiences not to take a serious issue seriously? It is fallacious to say that the answer to that question is either or. It's a little off column A and a little off column B. The seriousness of the Holocaust was not lost on Brooks, and according to Brooks, all comedy must have limits and intent. In the Spiegel interview, Brooks says, the philosophy of the film is, people can get over anything. No, they can't. They can't get over a concentration camp. So where does Brooks draw the line? In 1974, I produced the Western parody Blazing Saddles, he continues, in which the word was used constantly. Ivy got it. Ivy got it. Ivy got it. Thin word was used constantly. Ivy gotta talk to you. Come here. Have you gone berserk? Can't you see that that man is a Nigerot? But I would never have thought of the idea of showing how a black was lynched. It's only funny when he escapes getting sent to the gallows. Oh, baby, you are so talented, and they are so dumb. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not Brooks' liberal use of the word in Blazing Saddles is helpful or harmful, and I'm not going to go into that today. Good morning, ma'am. And isn't a lovely morning? Up your eye. But the point here is Brooks believes that not all comedic targets are created equal. Prairie shit. Shh. Everybody. Comedy is by its very nature transgressive, and borders and norms do need to be challenged, even surrounding such sensitive topics as the Holocaust. But in order to be effective, that transgression must be used carefully and with intent. That border to transgression to Paraphobia is the will effective. The offense bar is also much higher now, unlike with the original film, which caused a flurry of controversy. When the Broadway show and subsequently the adaptation of the musical got released, these barely got an indifferent shrug on the issue of depiction of nazis. By this point, even moms don't find it edgy. We read in a post-South Park world, a post-Family Guy world, a post-downfall meme world. So perhaps Hitler is too powerless. And when people express concerns about literal Nazis or Nazi-adjacent useful idiots, applause the responses become, "Why do you have to call everyone you disagree with a Nazi?" But this cartoonization of Nazism is also a sign of changing times, just like the producers was a sign of changing times in 1967. And I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing, but it having an effect on the way that we treat our history. Media like South Park reinforces a worldview where nothing really matters and everything is fair game. And South Park has historically gotten away with this because the message and intent is clear. But South Park's imitators seem not to understand why South Park gets away with transgressive humor with relatively little blowback, and they don't. How is your representation framed? Is it romantic? Or is it derisive? Or is it comedic? And most importantly, whose expense is the joke? All humor is based on some form of transgression. Even a pea in the face is ever tinny societal transgression. I'm not saying don't transgress, and I'm not saying societal mores and constructs don't need to be challenged. However, if you are going to make a joke at the expense of a historically shat-upon group that is not your own, you need to accept also that there might be consequences, and people might not think you funny. 1. There is no such thing as equal opportunity offensive because not all groups exist on equal footing. Maybe one day. Probably never. But right now, we are nowhere near that. Brooks cited the near lynching of Bart in Blazing Saddles as a line he would not cross. There is nothing funny about the image of a black man being lynched, and Brooks owns the fact that he, a white Jewish comedian, has no business depicting the image of a black man being lynched used for comedy. 2. Brooks is not down with Gentiles appropriating Jewish suffering and genocide, let alone shocking for shocking's sake. And ridiculing Hitler's theatricality is not the same thing as making a joke about Jewish genocide. It's just not. Mel Brooks is a 91-year-old man. He spends a lot of time these days going on tour and jumping around on stage doing interviews talking about what a great guy Gene Wilder was, and I hope he keeps doing that. It was such a wonderful part of my life. I hope he spends his twilight years reflecting on his successes and doesn't Find out that a very large portion of the Gentile internet is using him as a defense for why Gentiles making anti-Semitic jokes is really okay because all satire is created equal. Look at the producers, even if you only call it satire after the fact because your joke didn't land. So yeah, you can totally joke about whatever. For the time being, free speech is the law of the land. But if you looking for a defense for your edgelord satire, maybe the Jewish man who served in Germany during World War I, maybe who has publicly spoken out against media that trivializes the suffering of the Holocaust, who has stated several times that there were lines that should not be crossed out of respect for oppressed groups, who has maintained that comedy is a weapon and even owing to the fact that you will fuck up its targets should be considered with caution and care and never with the intent of upholding unjust power structures rather than dismantling them. Maybe this guy is not your best defense. You gotta know is everything is showbiz. I'll myself watch me showy of the German Ethel Merman. Don't you know we are crossing borders? The new world order is here.